Night fell on Dresden like a shroud, quiet and unsuspecting. The city, known for its elegance and calm, had survived nearly 6 years of war without the devastation that had consumed other German cities. For years, its citizens believed they lived under a kind of divine protection. The air raid sirens that haunted Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne were sounds Dresdeners only heard in stories. But on the night of February 13th, 1945, that illusion would die in fire. The first sign came not from sound but from silence, the kind that presses on the lungs, that strange stillness before a storm. Families sat together in their modest homes, candlelight flickering across worn tables. Some prayed. Others ignored the distant thunder that grew louder beyond the Elbe River. A mother pulled her children close, reassuring them that Dresden was safe, that the war would pass them by. But far above, in the black sky over Saxony, more than 200 Lancaster bombers had already crossed into German airspace, their engines forming an unbroken drone that could soon be heard even from the ground. At 9:51 p.m., the first sirens began. The city froze. People hesitated for precious seconds. Many still didn't believe they were the target. Then came the flares. Green and red lights fell through the clouds like ghostly stars. To children, they looked almost beautiful. Within minutes, the beauty ended. The first wave of bombs struck the northern districts, erupting in deafening blasts that ripped apart homes, hospitals, and churches. The ground shook as if the earth itself were breaking apart. In the old city, centuries of architecture crumbled in seconds. The air filled with dust, glass, and screams. Streets that had once echoed with music now echoed with chaos. The fires spread fast, feeding on dry timber and fuel lines. Roofs collapsed in waves, sparks raining down like embers from a dying world. For those hiding underground, the noise became unbearable. The city above seemed to be dissolving. The pressure from each blast forced air into cellars, extinguishing lamps and leaving families in total darkness. The first bombing lasted barely half an hour, but when the noise stopped, Dresden was no longer the same city. Above the ruins, the sky glowed red. The first wave had passed, but the silence that followed was not relief. It was dread. Survivors climbed out of the rubble, coughing through smoke, looking for light. They didn't know a second wave was coming. Just after midnight, new engines approached. This time, hundreds more. The second attack turned destruction into annihilation. The fires joined together, pulling oxygen into their core, creating a firestorm so fierce that the wind itself became deadly. Flames leapt higher than buildings. People were lifted off the ground and hurled into the blaze. The heat reached 1,500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt metal and turn streets into rivers of molten tar. The roar of the fire drowned every human sound. Entire families vanished. By dawn, the heart of Dresden was gone. In that night of terror, half a century of beauty, art, and life disappeared in a single sweep of fire. The people who survived would never forget the sound, the heat, or the moment they realized their city, once called the Florence on the Elbe, had been erased from the world. Before the flames, there had been a dream. Dresden was more than a city. It was a symbol of what Germany believed itself to be: cultured, refined, eternal, built along the Elbe River. Its domes and spires are the pride of Saxony. Painters like Canaletto once captured its golden skyline, while composers like Wagner filled its grand halls with sound. The people of Dresden saw themselves as the guardians of art and civilization, untouched by the brutality of the outside world. Even as the 1930s darkened with the rise of Nazism, Dresden remained wrapped in its illusion of safety. When Hitler came to power, the city joined the national chorus of pride. Banners flew, parades filled the squares, and the air carried a sense of rebirth. Dresden's beauty became part of the regime's propaganda. The pure Germany, the cultured Germany, a nation of light rising from defeat. But beneath the pride was denial. As bombs fell on Hamburg and Munich, Dresden still lived in a fragile bubble of normality. Concerts played. Theaters opened their doors. The Semperoper continued performances even as refugees began arriving from the east, carrying stories of Russian tanks and shattered towns. Many citizens pitied them but believed Dresden would never share their fate. The reasoning was simple. Dresden had no war industries, no large military bases. only art, porcelain, and churches. To them, that was enough to make it sacred. They will never bomb us, people said. We are too beautiful. It was a comforting lie. By 1945, the war had already turned against Germany. The Allies had crossed the Rhine in the west. The Soviets were closing in from the east. Hitler's dream of empire was collapsing, and the world had begun to see Germany not as a nation, but as a symbol of destruction that needed to be undone. In that climate, Dresden's untouched beauty made it stand out, a visible reminder of what still survived. To Allied strategists, it was not just a city. It was a message waiting to be sent. The British saw it as a transport hub feeding German troops in the east. The Americans saw it as a chance to break morale and speed the war's end. And for the Soviet allies waiting on the far side of the front, Dresden's destruction would be a signal that the Western powers were doing their part to crush what was left of the Reich. Inside Dresden, few understood any of this. They continued to live in the shadow of faith, that beauty could protect them, that God would spare them, that their leaders knew what they were doing. The dream that had carried them through a decade of propaganda and pride was about to meet the one thing that propaganda could never control: fire. Across the Channel, in the cold fields of England, bombers lined up under the moon. The air smelled of fuel and frost. Mechanics checked engines. Navigators studied maps illuminated by red lamps. On the mission board, one word was circled: Dresden. The operation had a name: Thunderclap. It was intended to crush the German will to fight by striking a city that had, until then, been untouched. The crews were young, barely in their 20s. Many had flown dozens of missions already. They were tired, hardened, and convinced that each flight brought the war closer to its end. Most did not question their orders. The goal was simple: destroy the enemy's ability to continue. When the first wave of British bombers left the ground on February 13th, it was already dark. They crossed over the North Sea and into Germany, navigating by radar in the glow of other burning cities far below. By the time they reached Dresden, the city's residents were just finishing dinner. The attack began with pathfinders dropping flares to mark the target. Green lights bloomed over the old town, reflecting off the river like eerie stars. Moments later, high explosives rained down, followed by thousands of incendiaries. Each bomb was small on its own, but together they created an inferno that no human city could withstand. The betrayal, when it came, was not deliberate but complete. Dresden had believed itself above war. Its people thought their culture and art made them safe. But to the men and the bombers, the city was just another grid square on a map, another objective to be completed. The war had become impersonal, mechanical, and merciless. As the second wave hit, the firestorm became unstoppable. The air roared with hurricane force. People were dragged from basements by the vacuum created by the flames. The temperature rose so high that glass and metal melted together, forming strange, twisted shapes that would remain in the ruins for decades. When morning came, the city was unrecognizable. Smoke still poured into the sky. The rail yard were gone. The cathedral stood in ruins. Tens of thousands lay dead or missing. And still, the bombing did not end. American planes arrived in daylight to strike what was left. For those who survived the night, it felt like betrayal not just from enemies, but from God himself. They had believed beauty could save them, and now they understood that in total war, beauty was the first casualty. When the fires finally burned themselves out, Dresden was a shadow. The city that once glittered with light and laughter was now a wasteland of twisted iron and ash. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of death. Survivors stumbled through rubble that stretched for miles, searching for water, for family, for any sign of life. Many never found it. The scale of destruction was beyond comprehension. More than 20 square miles reduced to ruins, tens of thousands dead, many burned beyond recognition. The Frauenkirche, the great symbol of Dresden's faith and beauty, stood wounded, its dome cracked and leaning, as if bowing to the dead. Days later, even that final monument gave way and collapsed into dust. Outside Germany, the world reacted with shock and unease. The Allies called it a military necessity, a blow meant to hasten the war's end. Others called it revenge. In neutral countries, the images of Dresden's ruins stirred moral outrage. Was it justice? Or had the victors crossed a line? That debate has never truly ended. In the years after the war, Dresden became a symbol, not just of destruction, but of memory. The survivors rebuilt, not with triumph, but with quiet resolve. They refused to let their city be defined by its ashes. The new Dresden that rose decades later carried both pride and sorrow, a city reborn from guilt and grief alike. But the true legacy of that night lives not in the buildings, but in the lesson it left behind. The bombing of Dresden remains a reminder of how quickly war can devour what humans hold most sacred. It was not the first city to burn, nor the last, but it became the most haunting, a place where civilization itself seemed to catch fire. For Germany, it marked a moment when denial turned to realization, when even those who had believed in destiny saw that their empire had destroyed itself. And for the world, it stood as proof that war spares nothing, not art, not faith, not innocence. In February 1945, as survivors stood among the ruins, one truth lingered. A nation that built its power on pride had found its end in silence. Dresden was gone, but its memory remained, etched not just in history books, but in the conscience of humanity. Loudspeaker subscribe for more forgotten stories of World War II, where power, pride, and destiny collide in the shadows of history.